Marissa's day didn't start well. Her head was pounding with pain, and all she wished for were to be far away from the noisy office, preferably by a cool river or by the sea. Marissa imagined the gentle waves rolling onto the sand and the warm sun tickling her shoulders and relaxed a little. Though she didn't have much time to daydream, her boss was waiting for the quarterly report. Marissa was his favorite, the most responsible and punctual of his subordinates, practically his right hand. And this unspoken title did not give her peace, so Marissa constantly felt the burden of responsibility. Suddenly the office door opened and her assistant Abby announced that a visitor had come with a personal matter. Marissa was surprised. "Strange. I'm not expecting anyone, but okay, tell her to come in." Marissa straightened her back, adjusted her hair with a barely noticeable movement, and slipped her feet into her shoes, which she had kicked off under the table to relax a little. A woman about 10 years younger than Marissa entered the office. She introduced herself as Jessica and looked challengingly at Marissa. "I came to tell you to leave Zachary alone," the visitor boldly declared, and every word echoed unpleasantly in Marissa's head. "How am I bothering him, and why should I leave my own husband?" Marissa calmly asked, although she was very surprised by the demands of the stranger. "Because you're keeping him. You're no longer young, and he feels sorry for you, that he loves me." Gasping for breath, in the midst of her emotions, Jessica explained that she was an orphan who had fallen madly in love with Zachary, Marissa's husband. Zachary felt the same way, but he was unable to be with Jessica because of his wife, who refused to let him go, citing an incurable illness or some other reason. According to Jessica, poor Zachary was completely tormented, torn between his feelings and his duty. "And besides, we're going to have a child," Jessica shouted so loudly that the entire office heard her. "Get out of our way, don't leave the child fatherless. You're already getting old. Why do you need a husband who's only with you out of pity? Give him freedom. He's still young at heart. Let him be happy." Marissa couldn't hide her surprise. She was certainly disappointed that Zachary had prepared such a gift for her on their 10th wedding anniversary. But on the other hand, the situation seemed funny to her. "Don't worry, I'll talk to my husband today. It's time for me to go to a nursing home, and he still has his whole life ahead of him. Go, and I'll take care of everything," Marissa said, looking at the confused girl with a smirk. When Jessica left the office, Marissa tiredly leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes again. She and Zachary had been married for 10 years, and at first didn't think about children, focusing on their careers. A couple of years ago, they finally decided it was time to have a child, but it didn't work out. Marissa thought it was because of stress, as both she and her husband had stressful jobs. But then she decided to check their health. And just yesterday, she picked up the results of their tests, where it clearly stated that Zachary cannot have children. That's why Jessica's story about her pregnancy cheered Marissa up, and now she most wanted to talk to her husband and see his reaction. Marissa, citing poor health, left work early and went home. "We need to talk seriously," her husband began as soon as Marissa entered the room. "Jessica came to see you today." "Oh, your mistress." "Yes, she came. She told me I'm too old for you, and it's time to set you free. And she also mentioned that she couldn't resist your charm and was now waiting for a child from you. Well, why are you like that? Yes, I'm guilty, but I wasn't going to leave you. We've been through so much together. And Jessica, she's so young and naive. She's not to blame for anything. If she offended you, I'll talk to her and she'll apologize." Marissa felt herself starting to boil with anger. Not only did his mistress have the audacity to come to her workplace and say all that, but her husband clearly thought she was a complete fool. "Zachary, do you even hear yourself? I don't need her apologies on your continued presence in this house. Pack your things and leave immediately before I start a real scandal." Zachary lowered his head and went to pack his things. Already standing at the threshold with his bag, he hesitated and made one more attempt to fix everything. "Marissa, let's not get too heated. Maybe we can somehow fix everything. I still love you." "My dear hubby, I have said everything, and besides, what are you talking about? You have a child on the way?" "Oh yes, the child," sighed Zachary. "Then of course it's better for me to leave." He opened the door, but Marissa suddenly called out to him and handed him the test results. She advised him to study them more carefully and slammed the door in front of him. She heard Zachary didn't leave, and apparently trying to understand what was written in the document. When he finally realized, he began screaming hysterically and pounding on the door in a fit of hysteria. "Marissa, what does this all mean? Explain it to me." "That's not my question, Zachary. Let your darling Jessica explain to you who the father of her child is. Leave me alone," Marissa shouted through the closed door. After hearing Zachary call the elevator and leave, Marissa felt a moment of sympathy for him. However, she quickly remembered that he wasn't worth it. Suddenly, she realized how tired she was from the day's events. She went into the guest room, lay down on the couch, covered herself with a big fluffy blanket, and finally allowed herself to cry. It was so painful to realize that she had been betrayed. Marissa reminisced about how she and Zachary had bumped into each other on the street almost 12 years ago. At the time, he was a clumsy and nearsighted medical student who knocked a box out of her hands. Despite his nervous stuttering, Marissa had helped him to believe in himself, and he eventually underwent laser eye surgery and transformed into a confident and handsome young doctor. Marissa's friends envied her for having such a great partner, but Marissa believed him because Zachary had always said that he loves only his Marissa. The betrayal of her husband had deprived Marissa of her last strength, and this could not help but affect her work. Her boss, a very fair leader who valued his employees, noticed this and, with a tone that tolerated no objections, set Marissa to rest by the sea. Marissa tried to choose a quiet place away from popular noisy resorts. For the first few days she simply lay on the beach, enjoying the warm rays of the sun, the gentle sea breeze and the sound of the waves. But after a few days she became bored and began discreetly observing the other vacationers. Her attention was particularly drawn to a young man, about 25 years old, who was dashing towards the waves with childlike enthusiasm and frolicking on the shore with the children. Some kind of freak, thought Marissa, or wild, as he had never seen the sea before, an adult but behaves like a boy. On the one hand, the young man's behavior caused her bewilderment, but on the other hand, Marissa was interested in observing his childishness. His unbridled energy plunged Marissa into childhood, when she too could allow herself to be just as spontaneous. Maybe Jessica was right, and I really did turn into an old woman, Marissa unexpectedly thought to herself. In the evening, Marissa began to feel sad and went to the nearest bar. Although she had avoided such places for a week, the thought that she had become too boring and old depressed her, and she decided to act against her principles and try to have some fun in a noisy company. At the bar, she noticed the same guy from the beach. He also noticed her and even waved, inviting her to sit next to him. Marissa pretended not to notice and took a seat at the other end of the bar. "Hi," she heard next to her. "May I sit down?" Marissa looked up and saw the same young man again. Unexpectedly for herself, she agreed and let the guy sit down. He introduced himself as Cameron, and she also said her name, trying to seem as indifferent as possible. "I noticed that you didn't really like how I behaved today on the beach. I know that I acted like a child, but that's really how I felt the first time at the sea." "Are you serious?" Marissa was surprised. Cameron nodded and told her that his parents insisted on the trip. The guy lived in a small town, and immediately after school started working with his father in an auto repair shop. After 5 years of work without vacation, his parents decided to make a gift to their son on his 25th birthday and forcibly sent him to rest in these beautiful places. Cameron asked if Marissa had been to the sea before, and she simply replied that she had been several times. Marissa could of course say that she was a successful and mature woman who had visited many resorts around the world, but for some reason she did not want to elevate herself in front of this naive working man. Somehow, imperceptibly, they got to talking, even though they had nothing in common, except for loneliness and a love for the sea. Cameron was too simple for Marissa, but his youth, directness, sincerity, and overflowing energy did their job, and after a few cocktails, Marissa unexpectedly found herself in the arms of a new acquaintance. To her surprise, Marissa realized that she had never been as satisfied in bed with anyone else as she had been with Cameron. Zachary was handsome, but not particularly gentle in bed. However, Marissa loved her husband and forgave him. Now looking at the sleeping Cameron, she could not understand how she could have lived like this before. By morning, the fog of passion and alcohol in her head had cleared, and the woman looked at things realistically. She understood that these relationships had no future. Yes, they were good, but that was it, and everyone had to return to their usual life. Marissa cautiously slipped out from under the covers, left Cameron's room, and then gathering her things, left the hotel the same morning. She was ashamed of her escape because Cameron didn't deserve it. But she could not act otherwise. On the way home, Marissa burst into tears, not knowing why. At work, she immersed herself in her papers, trying not to think about her loneliness, but in the evenings, she recalled the sunny beach and the cheerful guide jumping among the waves again and again. At times, Marissa regretted not leaving Cameron her phone number or address, but then convinced herself that nothing would have worked out between her and the poor guy from the car repair shop anyway. Marissa had tried to meet people through social networks and even went on a couple of dates, but the empty stories of her companions about vacations at expensive resorts, prestigious cars, and the like did not interest her at all. Her thoughts constantly returned to Cameron. Zachary had tried to come back into her life several times. After the DNA test accurately confirmed that the child was not his, he parted with Jessica. Just imagine, she wasn't even an orphan. She was constantly deceiving me, he complained to his ex-wife. Forgive me, Marissa. We were so good together. Let's start over. Zachary, I haven't been interested in you for a long time. I advise you to find a normal woman and live with her peacefully, and let me fix my life too. I'll never be able to forgive you for your meanness, especially since now I know that you're not the best and honest man in the world, and besides, you weren't a great lover. Marissa retorted. Zachary was shocked by his ex-wife's words, and decided that she was just taking revenge on him out of spite and hitting him where it hurt most. But Marissa really thought that way. After a night with Cameron, she realized that there were no true feelings in her relationship with her husband. It is unknown how Marissa's life would have turned out if it were not for her assistant Abby. The woman had become good friends lately and often sat together in a cafe after work and on weekends went bowling or skating. When the hot summer arrived, Marissa felt how the heated city was pressing on her with its noise and stuffiness. She began to suffer from migraines again, and her reluctance to sit in the office all day and then return to her stuffy apartment only grew. Abby, I'm completely broken, she complained to her friend. Let's go somewhere for the weekend. Only it must be a place near a river or a lake. I swear I'll get in the water and sit there until we leave. So let's go to my grandmother's, Abby exclaimed happily. She lives in a small town. There's a river and a forest around there. At first, Marissa was hesitant about staying at Abby's grandmother's house, since Abby was her granddaughter and Marissa was a stranger. However, Abby assured Marissa that her grandmother was a very hospitable person, and Marissa eventually agreed to stay. On Friday evening, the women arrived at Abby's grandmother's house and found her waiting for them in the garden at a set table. Though they tried to refuse a treat at such a late hour, but the old lady wouldn't listen to anything. Nothing will happen to your figures. You'll swim tomorrow. It's great fitness, laughed Mrs. Sandberg. Yeah, sure. Only I don't know how to swim, laughed Abby. How? Wondered Marissa. And I thought that tomorrow you and I will swim to the other side to race against each other. Abby waved her hands and warned Marissa to give up the idea right away because the river was treacherous due to its cold underground currents, and even the strongest and bravest guys from the town did not dare to swim to the other side. Marissa did not believe it and even laughed, thinking that Abby was just cowardly because she couldn't swim. But Mrs. Sandberg also confirmed that it was better to be careful with their river. But Marissa was unstoppable. Early in the morning, while her friend was still in bed, Marissa, wearing a swimsuit and a light robe, ran to the river. A fog was floating over the river, creating a quiet and calm atmosphere. Enchanted by the beauty of nature, Marissa ran and plunged into the invigorating coolness of the river. After making a couple of dozens of strong strokes, she found herself in the middle of the river and felt an incredible calmness. And where is the dangerous river here? She snorted and started to swim towards the opposite shore. But it didn't take a minute for Marissa to feel the icy cold. Her muscles seized with unbearable cramps, and the woman in despair began to call for help. Marissa shouted with all her might, but she realized in her heart that hardly anyone would hear her at this hour. Most likely, these were the last minutes of her life. She lost consciousness. Marissa came to her senses on the shore. It turned out that in response to her cry for help, a guy who was sitting on the riverbank with a fishing rod had rushed into the river. If it weren't for his desire to fish early in the morning and his ability to perform artificial respiration, that morning would most likely have been Marissa's last. But this was not the only miraculous coincidence. Looking at her savior, Marissa couldn't believe her eyes. "Cameron, is that you? Or am I hallucinating?" "Yes, Marissa, it's me. How did you get here? And anyway, where had you disappeared then? I almost went crazy. Did you feel bad with me?" Marissa looked at Cameron shyly and confessed she had never felt as good with anyone as she did then, and she was just scared. An hour later, they sat on the spacious terrace of his house, eating delicious apple pie and drinking tea. "Son, maybe you should introduce us, after all," Mrs. Beasley reproached her son. "This is Marissa, my fiancée," Cameron confidently replied. Marissa even coughed in surprise. "She came here yesterday and stayed at Mrs. Sandberg." Mrs. Beasley was surprised why her son's fiancée didn't stay in their house. Cameron calmly lied, saying that Marissa follows strict rules and refuses to live under one roof with her fiancé before the wedding, and therefore, in his opinion, they needed to get married as soon as possible. "And don't you want to ask me?" Marissa whispered in protest. "Didn't you remember that you already agreed? We're submitting the application the day after tomorrow. Mum, she is probably just overheated in the sun." Cameron smiled. "I thought so." Mrs. Beasley smiled, shaking her head. A noisy wedding took place in the town a month later. Cameron admired Marissa, and she eagerly awaited the moment when she would be alone with her beloved again, hear his passionate words and dissolve in his tender embrace. The young couple were so absorbed in each other that they thought they were alone, and only their love and happiness reigned around them. 9 months later, Marissa gave birth to a son for her husband. That's how one scandalous visit from a brazen mistress sharply changed Marissa's life. "I should probably thank Jessica," the young mother thought when she first held her baby born from her beloved man.